Hello and welcome to Watching Brief. As my partner in crime, Marc of Archaeosoup, says. Now, you might have noticed that, in fact, he's not here today. I'm flying solo, and that's because he's not feeling too great. Nothing serious. We hope he's going to be back in action very, very soon. But for today and for this week's Watching Brief, I've been trusted with the camera and the video link because we are going to be talking about an archaeological conundrum, a heritage management conundrum that has grown up in Australia in the last few years, in particular in the state of Western Australia, following an unfortunate incident with some high explosives and some very sensitive cultural sites of First Nation peoples, Australian Aboriginal peoples. We're joined by Rhys Booth. Rhys is an Australian archaeologist who's worked extensively in Oz, including on Indigenous sites, and but also has worked in England and has been a friend of Archaeosoup and the Pipeline and the Watching Brief for as long as we've been going, really. So we're delighted to have him on the programme at last. And he's here on condition that we don't mention the cricket. So,
two wickets.
Rhys, for anybody outside the UK or Oz who doesn't get the reference, England are currently playing Australia in what's called the Ashes series. It's like the World Series of cricket, only better. Last week England lost from a winning position. It hurts. But anyway, we're here to talk about archaeology. So, Rhys, this is a story that really begins a few years ago with an unfortunate incident involving the mining conglomerate Rio Tinto, and an unfortunate incident with some high explosives and a couple of very sensitive Aboriginal cultural sites at a place called, I think, Juukan Gorge in Western Australia. Can you explain a little bit about the background to what happened at the gorge and the fallout from it?
Yeah, sure thing, Andy. So Juukan Gorge, it's two different cave sites, Juukan 1 and Juukan 2. These were cave sites that were discovered during the investigations of that area, because Rio Tinto was effectively looking at opening a mine there for iron ore, I believe. They had several options, whether to do an open cut mine or a blast mine, that kind of thing. And unfortunately, in the process of creating this new mine, they decided that the two archaeological sites were effectively not important enough, or not on their radar in any great means, to keep, and they blew up these sites after being told that they are actually nationally and internationally significant sites. Not being somebody who's actually worked there, I can only tell you what I know and understand through what I've seen through the media and through my Australian contacts. And basically, what we have to understand is, in Australia, there's very little to no evidence at the moment that suggests Indigenous Australians, Aboriginal peoples existed at the same time as megafauna. And we just don't have very many sites that show anything akin to butchering of these types of animals or hunting, that kind of thing. Juukan Gorge apparently had some evidence of this, making it an extremely important site, let alone a sensitive site to the local Indigenous peoples whose country they were working on. As my understanding that the Aboriginal, two Aboriginal tribes that come from that particular area only found out a very short time before the demolitions happened that they were actually going to happen. And this has been, in the media, it's been portrayed as a fault of the lack of legislation. That legislation was from 1972, so it is quite old, and what most people suggest, it's not fit for purpose, and it heavily sides with the mining and mineral industries. And in this case, the mining industry used Part 18 of the 1972 Act to basically go ahead and destroy the site. So technically, from a legal point of view, they may not have actually done anything wrong. But when you take a look at the moral side of things, when you take a look at what's actually been lost, that's where we've got the issue. And what's happened since then, since 2017, 2018, is the Western Australian state government has introduced a new bill, a new set of legislative laws on Indigenous heritage, to hopefully make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen again.
And I'll just add a little bit of detail to that, if I'm it was certainly published at the time that in effect the rescue archaeology at the site, or at the sites, was undertaken by an Australian archaeologist called Dr. Michael Slack. And he was certainly quoted at the time as saying, and I'm quoting here, the Juukan 2 rock shelter has amazing potential to radically change our understanding of the earliest human behaviour in Australia. And he continued, to date, there's no other site of this age with faunal remains in unequivocal association with stone tools. The significance of this cannot be overstated. And yet, as you say, the Section 18 provision basically appears to have allowed Rio Tinto to proceed, although it was meant to make its best endeavours not to damage Indigenous cultural material. Now, I think what appears to have angered a lot of people is that actually Rio Tinto admitted that they had 4 options for developing the site. 3 of them wouldn't have damaged the rock shelters.
Yeah.
But the 4th option, which is the one that they chose, was the one to blast the sites, and allegedly that was done to access a higher quality of iron ore, and therefore presumably to increase the profits of Rio Tinto in working the site. And I think there was also, if I understand correctly, there was also some controversy of the fact that the holes had been drilled and loaded with explosives before really there was any chance for the outside bodies to intervene. And Rio Tinto argued that it wasn't safe to actually unload the blast holes, and the blasting had to continue.
Yeah. So it's one of these things, and you experience this wherever you go, where there's cultural resource management in the world, where developers factor in, if I destroy a site, what's the maximum fine I can get for doing this kind of thing, or is there jail time, things like that. I'm not saying Rio Tinto did that. I cannot say one way or another whether it was safe or not. I would have no real experience with explosives. So it's one of those things where you've got to look at it with a grain of salt, and you've got to really wonder, is what Rio Tinto saying, is it true? And you've got to kind of really scratch your head on this one, because the thing is that if that same thing had happened in Victoria or New South Wales, for example, there would have been fines. There possibly would have been jail time, where the legislation in different states is very different at the moment in Australia. We do have a federal government heritage legislation, which effectively runs over federally protected sites and sites within federal boundaries. So, for example, the Northern Territory and Canberra might come under federal legislation because they're under direct control of the federal government. Where I have most of my experience in Victoria, we have very specific state legislation that basically spells out how these types of processes are meant to take place. I'm not saying that Western Australia didn't have those in place, but because they are so old, they're not really fit for purpose.
I've certainly observed cases in Britain where, and in fact, we covered one on Watching Brief recently, where a developer appears to have calculated that by undertaking an illegal demolition, they could get away with, they could force a local authority into a position where it would just have to accept a fait accompli that, and then they might be able to go ahead with the development that had previously been vetoed. So this is a playbook that is used all over the world. Whether or not Rio Tinto were playing games, it's certainly the case that they appear to have misjudged the situation quite badly, or at least they got themselves into a situation where they were in real trouble, because in 2022, just last year, the company was forced to announce that its then chairman, a man called Simon Thompson, and a non-executive director called Michael Lestrange, who was a former civil servant, in fact, I think was previously a high commissioner in Britain, were forced to actually stand down before a shareholders meeting as a result of the Juukan scandal. And they appear to have come under a lot of pressure from investors over the bad publicity that it engendered.
Yes, and that's not surprising, because these mining companies, a lot of their advertising, their work in remote and regional parts of Australia where there are large groups of Indigenous people living on country. They have to often negotiate with the Indigenous groups. They have to quite often have previous some type of relationship with these groups going forward, which quite often results in jobs for Indigenous people, and that's the way that the mining companies like to portray themselves. They want to be seen as bringing. They might be taking minerals from the ground, but they're also bringing a lot of good things into those particular remote communities. And one of the key things here is that quite often the work that they pay to get done, so archaeological surveys, archaeological excavation, all that kind of thing, the anthropological work that's being done, so learning about Indigenous language and cultures, it wouldn't be done if it wasn't for the mining companies in those areas. So it's one of those catch-22s. As you'd know, Andy, we only do the work because something's about to be potentially destroyed.
Yeah.
And that is the
concept of preservation by record, basically, which is the basis of most commercial archaeology these days.
Exactly right. And in this case, like you would also understand how rare it is that something might be kept in either situ or in perpetuity, because it's considered such an important place, site. The cultural heritage there is so important, that kind of thing. It is extraordinarily rare for that to happen. It's rare for sites to effectively hold up any kind of development, as you would understand. In most of my working life, I have never seen a site be protected in the sense that no development was allowed on that site. And we're talking from everything from rock art to stone lithics to burials, sites associated with Indigenous Australian cultural heritage. Quite often you'll find that large areas are developed. We build by the suburb now, as they say. So we are dealing with huge amounts of land at any one time. And quite often the archaeology is just a very small part of that process. And the main difference from where I live in Victoria to Western Australia, in a lot of the cases, is that in Victoria we have a system where RAPs have been set up, and RAPs are it's a shorthand term for registered Aboriginal parties. Tribes might be a local, like a lay term. So these tribal areas and boundaries are where the Indigenous people are responsible for their own heritage effectively. So the archaeologists will go out there with the Indigenous people, work cheek by jowl, hand in hand, at every stage of that process to make sure that it's being done properly. But more importantly as well, the approval of the CHMP or Cultural Heritage Management Plan is usually approved by the RAP. It's approved by the Indigenous people themselves. Not that they have too many options of denying CHMP. Usually it's, rather than a straight out denial, it'll be you have to go back and we want more excavation over here, things like that. And in Western Australia, as far as I understand it, it's not actually a requirement for that kind of relationship to happen. And because I haven't done any work in Western Australia, I can't attain to how much negotiations done with Aboriginal people. But as far as I know, this new legislation that's meant to be introduced on July 1st of this year is meant to help push that kind of a system through.
We'll come to the new legislation and also the opposition to it, which is what really first attracted us to dealing with this subject now. In a moment, I think just to finish off on the Juukan Gorge case, I think it's worth hearing how Rio Tinto tried to frame it after the effect when they were trying to deal with the fallout from it, really. This is what Simon Thompson, the outgoing chair, said just before the AGM where he was to stand down. He said, "I'm proud of Rio Tinto's achievements in 2020, including our outstanding response to the COVID-19 pandemic and a second successive fatality-free year, significant progress with our climate change strategy and strong shareholder returns." But then he went on to say about the specific project, which I've just discovered actually was codenamed Brockman 4 by Rio Tinto. I'd just like to stress it, cards on the table, there is absolutely no connection between my family name and the Brockman 4 operations of Rio Tinto in Western Australia. What Mr. Thompson said was, quote, "However, these successes were overshadowed by the destruction of Juukan Gorge rock shelters at the Brockman 4 operations in Australia, and as chairman, I'm ultimately accountable for the failings that led to this tragic event." Now, it's interesting to see again. We talked about the shareholders and how sensitive this was for the companies in cultural terms. One of the leading shareholders in companies like Rio Tinto are pension funds, or sometimes they're called superannuation funds. And in again, ahead of the same meeting, the head of the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors, who's a woman called Louise Davidson, said that the move of the Rio Tinto board was a move for board accountability for cultural and operational failures. And then she went on to say, in particular, investors would like to see the board increase its connection with Australian operations and communities, as well as increasing mining experience. That was taken to be a warning, basically, that investors wanted to see more care taken over these. They didn't want to see this situation arising again.
A watching brief is a formal programme of observation and investigation to record and report on notable discoveries on an archaeological site. As part of our ongoing watching brief, Andy and I work hard to bring you the best, the worst, and sometimes the more quirky happenings from the world of archaeology. We aim to provide a space where voices can be heard, opinions shared, and sometimes truth spoken to power. If you believe in the work we do, please consider supporting us on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Thank you.
The government of Western Australia introduced new heritage legislation, supposedly updating the previous regime and to prevent something like this happening again. It was meant to come into effect on July the 1st, but it's come in for a great deal of, well, I say great deal, it's come in for some quite loud criticism, particularly in parts of the media and for particular communities. So can you explain what's happened?
Yeah, sure. So from my understanding, keeping in mind that it is not my part of the country, so there might be things I'm not aware of, but from my understanding, the legislation was effectively a knee-jerk reaction to this happening. It was extremely bad publicity for Rio Tinto, and it effectively lit a fire not only under Rio Tinto but other major mining companies such as BHP, which basically put a magnifying glass to them and their activities in this sense. And the Western Australian...
And I think it's worth pointing out here as well that along with elsewhere in the world, these large mining conglomerates, along with other companies involved in areas like fossil fuels, are under a lot of are under the microscope at the moment because of the response to the climate emergency and environmental concerns. So it's not just cultural heritage that's at stake here, is it?
No, not at all. And a lot of these companies like to, from my understanding, is wrap up their companies in a language which portrays them as being green or being environmentally friendly and things like that, which you can kind of like. Maybe it's a sincere thing. I'm not sure, but from companies I've worked with, for example, that have that kind of language built into their business statement or something like that when they're trying to get clients, they'll say, we're a green, environmentally friendly company, and they might not even have a recycling bin, in their main office. But in the case of this legislation, what the controversial parts, as far as I can see, is that it's gone through very, very quickly as a knee-jerk reaction, and not everybody is on board with what's being produced. And I'm not across the new legislation in its entirety. I kind of understand what they're trying to do, but the problem really is that in Western Australia specifically, mining and agricultural sectors are very, very worried that they won't be able to practice as they have always done. However, the state government has said, no, don't worry. You'll be able to continue your practices as per usual on the land that you've already been doing this kind of thing on. However, that does kind of leave that point of any future endeavours will then come under the new legislation, which will come under renewed criticisms under that legislation, and we'll have to go through those new investigatory processes that they may not have done in the past. And in this case, I believe Western Australia, like I said before, wants to introduce something similar to a RAP system as they have in Victoria, as they have in New South Wales, where Indigenous people are actually part of the bureaucratic process in approving development, in approving new mines and things like that. And as you can imagine, that could leave a bad taste in certain companies' mouths, even though they say they want to work cheek by jowl with Indigenous peoples. It seems to only be lip service in a way, because as soon as you give Indigenous people any kind of authority in the approval of things going forward, they get scared. They don't necessarily want that to happen. And there is another point of contention here, and that is the Western Australian government has been accused of not funding these new Indigenous corporate bodies properly. So the way that the RAPs work at the moment is they work like companies, but quite often these companies are made up of extended family, usually people of all of the same tribe. For example, in the area that I live, it's the Wadawurrung people. So any development and approvals that go on here will go through their office if they trigger if it triggers the heritage process. So if the same thing was to happen in WA, it means that they're going to need appropriate funding to set up as an actual corporation first, which then, begs the question, has begged the question in the media, how serious is the Western Australian government about this? Do they want these corporations to fail? Because some of the people have suggested that if they're not funded properly, it means they can't do effectively their oversight properly, and that then means that anything can still happen.
We'll link below the line to an article from ABC, Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which outlines the issues with the new Western Australian legislation. I mean, the argument there is that the new legislation, effectively its new planning law, removes the Section 18 process that we spoke about earlier, which was the loophole that enabled Rio Tinto to destroy the site. And it basically adds a layer to the planning process, and that's the criticism that is quoted from a number of quarters. One is a farmer called Ian Noakes, who is quoted as saying that he was concerned that the government change would impact on plans to expand irrigation on his farm. And he said, quote, "It's taken us more than a year to try and negotiate changes, and we've gotten nowhere with the Margaret River Shire Council," another layer of government, the local government. And then you add another process on top. He said, "I think it will be very frustrating, and the whole planning process in this area is frustrating enough at the best of times." Now, that's obviously that we hear this from developers in England as well, in the UK as well. It's the planning law gets in the way of development and innovation, and is economically a drag.
Yes. So, and this is the really interesting thing as well, is that development is not it uses so many different professions to go ahead at any one time. Heritage is just one of them. Then you've got the environment layer, and then you've got health and safety and all sorts associated with it. But in this case, it's really interesting, because if we're looking at stakeholders here, the farmers, the miners, they're a key stakeholder in this, and they need to be listened to as well. And this needs to be really done in almost a bipartisan cooperative way. Otherwise, it's almost guaranteed to fail. In Victoria, they say, if, excuse my French, but if it doesn't piss everybody off equally, then it's probably not working right. And that is kind of what is key here, is that, for example, there are going to be triggers for heritage work to be done, and these triggers, for example, in Victoria, it could be something as simple as building a new dam to retain water. If there is a site within 50 metres or maybe 200 metres of a named waterway, that's how difficult it is for average Joe to go through that legislation and try to work this stuff out for themselves. And it becomes a problem more so when it's somebody trying to, for example, to develop maybe 2 or 3 houses within an area that might be considered sensitive, and they're quite a small, it might be considered quite a small endeavour, and heritage work isn't cheap for the most part, especially to get the approvals that you might need. However, if you're talking about larger industry, agriculture, mining and things like that, these guys have the money to do that kind of work. And it's just another part of them doing it. So you've got all these different factors. You've got the little guy, you've got the sole farmer who might want to add new agriculture, and then you've got the mining companies who incorporate this stuff into their companies. They have archaeologists and anthropologists working directly for them. These guys, they don't just hire external consultancies. They actually have heritage, what we call a heritage advisor, working for them. And this is the key thing here, is that developers, and maybe not even developers, but people who just want to add infrastructure to their properties, need to get in contact with a heritage advisor in most cases. And this is usually, like I said, an archaeologist or an anthropologist. Some cases it's even an architect or a historian, because these people are trained in how to deal with this legislation. And that's what's got a lot of people worried, is that what they simply quite often just don't understand it. They want to simply dig that dam. They want to build that extra wall. And this is what's got people scared, effectively, is they don't know where they land.
And as we begin to draw this to a close, and I think what's interesting for me exploring this with you as we're talking, it's the commonalities with our understanding of developer-funded, developer-driven, whatever you want to call it, commercial archaeology in Australia, in Britain, in America, across most of Europe and in other jurisdictions, but also the specific issues. So, for example, in the United States, Canada, Australia, you have particular sensitivities around Indigenous peoples, First Nations, etc., and so on. We use different terminology in different places, but it comes down to the same thing. It's about respecting the cultural heritage of not just white Europeans, but of people who were there before the colonial period. But I think the other thing that struck me reading up the background to this is it's, as in the UK at the moment, and we're having our own conversations about, in the case of the UK, it's retained EU, European Union environmental law. There's a bill going through Parliament at the moment which could see environmental checks and balances, legal checks and balances, curtailed or even removed, which is concerning a lot of the heritage and environmental NGOs in particular. And the same arguments are being deployed about, well, you can't, growing the economy is important. The law mustn't be used to, and the environment mustn't be used as an excuse to prevent development. And it's the direct correlation with politics. Now, I noticed that again, we've seen this many times before, but there's a petition. But it's been organised by the Western Australian Pastoralists and Graziers Association, and at the time of recording, that's received something like 30,000 signatures. That's what's actually asking for that 6-month delay in the rollout of the regulations, and the president of that association, a man called Tony Seabrook, says, the people I represent feel this is a very poorly written piece of legislation. The best thing to do is to scrap the whole damn thing and start again. He said, it's not about destroying Aboriginal culture and heritage. This is an act that could cost us hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of dollars. And I think before we began recording, we were talking about this, and you said to me that a lot of the opposition to this in the media is being driven by, in particular, the Murdoch press, which is anti the current government, both federally and I think in Western Australia.
To a point, what you've got to what you've got to know about Australian media in particular is that Murdoch owns well over 70% of our newspapers and our media, which is, I think it's the highest in the Western world, like the most, the most media owned by a single individual in the Western world. I mean, they did start off here over 100 years ago, and that's something that, some of us are drastically ashamed of. But the thing here is that Murdoch generally, the right-wing media, I suppose, if you want to call them that, generally supports the mining industry, the agricultural industry, and does not like to see them being pushed around by government legislation. Anything that makes mining or agriculture harder, Murdoch is usually going to be on their side. Usually because the parties, for example, the National Australia Party and the Liberal or the Tory Party, you'd know them as, generally get those votes. And it's difficult at the moment, because what's happened at the moment is the Western Australian government is the largest Labor-held government in Australia, and in fact is the most popular government ever had, apparently ever had in Australia, by a number of seats that they hold. So they have a unique opportunity here to get this legislation right. And this is the key thing. As an archaeologist, I want to see obviously as an archaeologist, I want to see the heritage protected, and I want to see the legislation to be being made to be fit for purpose, rather than a knee-jerk reaction where it placates maybe some to the mining industry, some to the Indigenous people, and then some to the local population. You really need a coherent legislation that people understand, but more importantly, that works at a bureaucratic level in a very smooth and timely manner, to allow for the development process to go through as cheaply as possible, keeping those people happy, to be as easy to understand for average Joe who might be, developing his own land, and also for the Indigenous people whose land is being developed in this way, and they may not approve or appreciate, and they deserve a voice in how that's done, if it's done at all in some cases. And I think right now, pushing this legislation through as quickly as they are, it's odd. I think personally, and this is just my view, it's a little odd to be pushing the legislation through when there are so many different stakeholders saying we have problems. And I think holding off for 6 months probably isn't the worst idea. However, that also could be, again, a tactic used by those stakeholders to try and push more of their own agenda forward within that legislation. And they could try and do it again and again until people get sick and tired of it. So it's one of those things where you have to go into it with your eyes wide open. You have to try to appreciate the positions of all stakeholders as you're designing the legislation. And quite simply, actually, one of the points that a friend made a couple of weeks ago is that we already have fantastic legislation in other states, Victoria and New South Wales. It's not perfect, and it's reviewed year in, year out, and there are always changes made. But Western Australia has a great blueprint to work from, and they don't seem to have done that. So there are questions there.
And I think, just to wrap up, I'll say that the Premier of Western Australia, Roger Cook, I think will probably disagree with you, because his response to the petition and the concerns and the request for a 6-month delay in the implementation of the new law is pretty unequivocal. He has said, quote, the laws are about a simpler, fairer, like-for-like transition of the current laws already in place. Where practices took place before, you can do it again. You can continue to sow crops, graze your animals, and build fences where they were before. The 6-month delay wouldn't achieve anything other than to draw out a difficult conversation already. And he then accused Mr. Seabrook, whose organisation was behind the petition, of being disingenuous. And he finally told ABC, I've grown up in Western Australia. I've seen these debates come and go. People predict the end of the world, and lo and behold, when these laws come into being, they find the world is a better place and we can continue to go about our business. So we'll see where this one lands. I suspect we might be back to talk about it again at some point. But for the time being, Rhys, thank you very much for joining us and for explaining the situation in Australia as you see it. And again, I hope our viewer will have picked up that they do things different there, but at the same time, many things they do the same, and it's really valuable to hear how colleagues in other parts of the world, in other jurisdictions, handle some of the knottiest problems in heritage management and dealing with people who have stakeholders in the land and in the archaeology. So again, thank you again for joining us in what must be pretty late in an Australian evening.
Yes, it is. It's starting to push my bedtime now. So anyway, I greatly appreciate it, Andy. And yeah, I'll keep an eye on this. If the legislation will probably go through on July 1st, and all I can say, it's going to be one of these watch and wait scenarios to see how the industry evolves around that legislation, and how the legislation will develop. So probably watch this space over the next year.
We will. And in the meantime, if you're watching this, if you've got any thoughts, any responses to what you've heard, or to the whole issue of how archaeologists relate to Indigenous peoples and their cultural concerns, please join the discussion below the line. Please consider supporting the Watching Brief on Patreon, and let's hope Marc gets better very, very soon. In the meantime, from Watching Brief, thank you for watching and see you next time.